Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Velero community meeting for September 28th, 2021. Today's facilitator will be Eleanor. Thank you, Eleanor, for handling this while I handle my internet disconnectivity.
My pleasure. So, of course, first of all, a reminder, as I'm doing, please add yourself to the attendees if you have not done so. And without further ado, we'll have some status updates. And then, okay, I see that Raphael has a discussion topic, and I would like to, if there's time, to give the Velero strategy presentation that I've been working on, talking about the Velero strategy that we're probably going to be pursuing, at least the VMware team members. So without further ado, let me go back to here. And Dave, I've forgotten, do I share anything or does Dave just talk as I show the screen?
I think if you've got the agenda up, that's fine.
Great.
Yeah, so so with RC2 being done, we'd said that at that point we were going to start looking at merging PRs again. So PRs are kind of open game for maintainers to approve and merge. I took the item snapshot or PR, no changes, but I took it out of draft and I tagged a bunch of, I think, all of the maintainers to review. If you have time and you're interested, please take a look, comments, and we'll have time throughout the 1.8 time frame to make changes. We're also looking at doing some stuff. So we've had our end-to-end tests, and one of the things we've never really done is verify that clusters are actually healthy after being backed up and restored. So we're looking at integrating Sonoboy, which is another open source project that does things like the Kubernetes conformance tests. We're looking at integrating that into a Velero end-to-end test, and we'll have that both for standard Kubernetes clusters, which it currently does, and we're looking at being able to add plug-in tests for things like our TKG management clusters. This may be something that's of interest with OpenShift or Rancher as well, so that we can have backup and restore end-to-end tests of the full thing. So that's pretty much it for me.
All right, any questions for Dave? Daniel, tell us what you've been up to.
Yeah. Last week, we tagged the version 1.7 RC2. And if there's no urgent blocking issues, very likely this commit will be used for the 1.7.0 GA. And we will also GA the new AWS GCP Azure CSI plugin around September 30th, before the end of this week. After that, I'll be switch the gear to Velero 1.8. One thing I want to mention is that after we switch to distroless as the base image of Velero, there may be some custom plugins fails after upgrades due to the missing dependent libraries. I know that Fong has saw that issue and he's working on that. So please keep an eye on that. I will also add a line in the release note about this problem. That's all.
Yes, I confirm that I hit the problem when I when my DB plugin for data domain storage. We used the library, a few library, and it's missing. So I have to add them in. I am still testing it. I don't know for sure that I fixed the problem completely yet, but I'm testing to resolve the problem. And hopefully it will fix it.
Thanks. Please update in the issue.
Yeah, I will keep you guys updated.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Wen Kai.
I had one more question. So
I'm so sorry. I should have asked. Please go on.
No. So we had raised another question about those vulnerabilities that we saw in 1.6.0. So this 1.7.0 went through the scanning. So is it scanned through any scanning tool?
Yeah, we have scanned using our tools, internal tools. I think I can share with you There is still a vulnerability of glibc, but that's the only one. Let me check. I can share you the.
Yeah, so the main problem is being because we shift into distro less, right? We will eliminate all of the vulnerability in other package. However, if we customer adding a Velero plugin in, and that bring more library in, and these might, if we bring in these might including some of the vulnerabilities with the package that we include, right?
Correct.
But yeah. So
unless,
what?
unless we will, scan it as the customer, I mean the developer can now sell and make sure that we go.
So Daniel, you mentioned. So what is the tool we are using to scan, and what is the severity of the remaining?
Yeah, I can share the screen, I think.
Sorry, just to confirm, would you like me to unshare so you can share?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this is we used app check to scan these images, and the vulnerability is glibc included in the glibc, which is still part of distroless. I think we are following up with Debian. Our scanning to market says a won't fix. I think that's a mistake. But we are keeping an eye on that because it still depends on Debian to fix it.
I see. And so, and what are the severities of those CVEs? The two.
App
you can
check.
check offline. No, the severity of the CVEs.
Let me check. I think the score is relatively high. Okay, let me check.
Oh, it's critical.
That's critical.
Yeah, because I don't remember seeing critical in the 1.6 vulnerabilities. So is this something?
It's a new CVE that is published on the.
Oh, I see. It's made.
Yep.
So any other questions for Daniel? Wenkai, can you tell us about what you've been working on, please?
Yes, I'm doing some work with Daniel for the Velero 1.7 release, and after that, I'm starting to do some investigation for the 1.8 items. Yeah, this is what I'm doing currently.
Thanks. Any questions for Wenkai? Okay, Bridget.
Hi, everyone. So I've had to spend some of my time looking at some of our internal release processes over the last week. But after that, I think I'm done with that now. I'm going to be looking ahead to 1.8 now. So part of that, the first thing I'm going to be looking at is picking up the plugin versioning work again. The design doc, I think Fong had left another couple of comments which I need to address, but I'd like to get that merged pretty soon, and then I'll sync with Fong on getting the next stages of the re-architecturing of the code in place, so that other changes that we're relying on it can make use of that. That's it for me.
Any questions for Bridget? Okay, moving on to discussion topics. Raphael, tell us about pre and post backup and restore plugins.
All right, thank you, Eleanor. Can I share my screen very quick? I noticed that last time I spoke about this topic, I think I lost the audience because it was way too much information. So this is an attempt to show what those plugins are about. So just refresh everybody on the call. Is additional plugin hooks to execute before and after the backup, before and after the restore. It's fundamentally different from the existing hooks that they execute per resource item. This is before and after the backup and the restore itself. So here's my attempt to explain where I'm proposing where those actions, the backup, I'm calling pre-backup actions and the post-backup actions, they're gonna happen. So this is today what's happening during the backup, okay? So this is a sequence of events. The new backup request comes, there is a validation of the request, then it flags the backup in progress. The backup starts, there is a function to discover all the plugins. We check if there is a backup with the same name, if so, then fails. Then finally we do the backup of resource items themselves, then volume snapshot. Then the final backup phase is determined. Then we persist on the object storage. That's oversimplifying all the code. So what we are proposing, the pre-backup actions happen around here. After the backup, check if the backup exists. Then we execute the actions. Then we actually do the backup of the resource items. For the post-backup actions, they execute after the backup is fully persisted on the object storage. Now, I had a conversation with Dave. Dave is working on the upload process that's gonna pretty much, and you can fix my understanding, Dave, is gonna pretty much break this sequence here. Basically, we're gonna do the backup, the resource items upload, then start the volume snapshot, then upload in parallel, where do other stuff in parallel. But nevertheless, the post backup action gotta happen after the full backup is done. Very similar with the restore. I'm not gonna go over the details here, but that's pretty much the pre-restore actions happen after a lot of stuff. It's validated, and actually before we start to restore items, and the post-restore actions happen after all the volume snapshots are restored. This one change on the design, hopefully that makes easier to understand where we see that those plugins gonna be executed. And finally, the other major change on the design proposal, it's the plugins will not mangle the status of the backup and restore object, but we are proposing to have additional status per plugin. So each plugin gonna have a struct like this, what the plugin name, what the start, the completion, and the phase. The phase is gonna be something very simple, in progress, completed, or failed. And then the backup status struct gonna add an optional array of this, because remember, you can have multiple plugins, right? So it's not gonna be one status for all the pre-backup and post-backup, because you can register multiple plugins. And have those for the same for restore status. So those are the big changes on the design based on some conversation I had with you, especially Dave. Thanks, Dave. And I'm still refining and so on. And I really want talking to Eleanor to have this to Velero 1.8 once we approve the design. And we have a prototype already running, by the way, of this, not with the statuses though, but actually the plugins already executing. That's all I have.
Sorry, I haven't read the design yet, but do you specify which, well, when we execute the action, it's supposed to execute some plug-in code, or it's supposed to be plug in some external code that we can hook in?
it's pretty much the same as the existing plugins today. And inside of the code, you pretty much can do whatever you want. For
So
example,
the system, the vendor, the backup vendor will have to develop a plugin and include it into the plugin. Included in the pod, the little pod that when we execute, when we run the
yes. You load like any other plugin, and they're gonna be executed inside of the pod that the control is running. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And
So-
Rafael, how does this relate to the pre-post backup hooks that we have right now?
So today the hook, you have to tell they're going to be executed per resource item. So let's say you want a hook for a pod or a hook for a PV. So you're already inside of the backup or inside of the restore. This, you don't give like a resource item to execute. It will execute once before the backup or after the backup, before the restore and after the restore. One classic example, there's a bunch of examples we can take advantage of those. But let's say you want to change, after restore, you want to configure DNS. Of course, you can have another script after the Velero restore to execute those. Of course, you can do whatever you want, but those plugins happen is Velero triggers those events. So let's say you create a Velero plugin to talk to a DNS provider, then change the DNS after you do restore, for example. Or before the restore, you can increase the cluster size.
I see.
Because that happens, right? You restore a cluster, oh, no, I don't have enough capacity and all the pods are hanging. So you can create a pre-restore plugin to check and expand the cluster according to the size of the backup. And the list goes on.
Another question about that, like for example, with the existing, they say take the restore item action plugin. There's two ways that those are put in place. There's the external plugins that we add as an init container, but then we also use restore item actions in Velero core for certain things that are just part of a restore. Once these are in place, I imagine these pre and post backup and restore actions, we could choose to implement a Velero feature by creating a post restore action internally as well, and then it wouldn't run in a separate container, analogous to the core restore item actions and things like that.
Yeah, this is the community to decide, but I do see a lot of core plugins that we can take advantage of that. You can have a knob on and off of Velero. You don't need to kill the controller, for example, to stop Velero. You can create a plugin that you just give a config map yes or no, and then you stop executing, for example. There's so many other, it opens a lot of possibilities here.
Yeah, I think, it's going to follow the existing plugin setup. So, pretty much the plugin manager knows about internal plugins and then is looking for the ones in the plugins directory. So we should be able to handle both types. And then I think the other thing we should put on the list, it may not be done right away, but we should really be able to execute a command in a container. And we should be able to specify a container. It like spins up a pod to execute that. So that we get, for end users, we can get some benefit as well, where they can write a script or something to execute in a container. So they don't have to write a bunch of Go code.
Oh, so I see what you're saying. It's like you spin off a separate pod, just to execute whatever you want.
Yeah, and we can just make and I think we should use the same mechanism. We should make like an execute a pod plugin that you can configure. And it can look at the backup and say, hey, do you have the hooks configured for this backup, for example, or something like that. But I'd like to use the same mechanism.
Right.
Yeah, because we're currently doing that on the per pod basis, right? The current pre and post backup hooks are doing that, and I think we should extend that feature, for end users to be able to use pretty easily. But
yeah, I think one of the
it fit in under this.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you had something where it could be a script, like Rafael, you mentioned, like having like a config map or something, or if you could like load some data with the script in and have it execute that. Because I think at the minute, all we have are just like single commands that can be executed, and then I think it's tricky
But-
for users to do that well. And
Well, no, because they can write a script and they can put it in a container. That's pretty easy to do.
well, that's true as well. Yeah.
And then we get a run context because we probably don't want to run scripts in the Velero pod.
But
Well,
yeah,
yes,
but we can
definitely
create a
not.
plugin that starts a pod that you can stick a
Yes.
whole script as a config map and then execute it.
Yeah, or you just say, here's a container to run, and here's the command to run from the container, and you put whatever you like in the container.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But that's out of the scope of this PR, right?
Oh yeah, this PR is just to create the hooks. And then after that we can, improve and create another plugins.
So for 1.8, very likely there will be a code in Velero to trigger those plugins and support the plugins, but the plugins will be installed. I mean, the plugins you want will be installed separately. It's not part of Velero.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I do have a plugin that cleans and uncleans applications. That's part of our project. But if we're gonna open up for the community, it's a different conversation.
Yep. I'll take another look at the PR.
Thanks all for the time. I always take a lot of time, and I apologize.
Thank you for helping us understand.
A quick question, sorry. It has a new type of plugin because we currently have, like backup item plugin, etc. Is there a new type of plugin for this hook plugin?
Yeah, gonna be 4 new types. Gonna call it pre-backup action, post-backup action, pre-restore action, and post-restore action. So 4 new hooks.
Oh, thank you.
Any other questions for Raphael before we move on? Okay, back to me then. I've got the last 2 action items. Let me reshare. A quick note about the 1.8 roadmap. We've finalized a little more. I did not get my act together enough to make a PR, so apologies. I should have that ready by next week. It's basically, that being said, what I think I talked about the last few weeks, basically things that are in the 1.8 milestone in the repo. The roadmap is the 1.8 roadmap is a subset of these. I think I can say with confidence. So by next week, I should be able to show you what team members are thinking of working on in top priority order. And obviously, this is really encapsulating what the VMware team members will be working on. So any other Velero community members, you are very welcome to add things to the roadmap. And that's why I want to get the PR done so that others can make PRs against it as necessary. Questions on that before I move on to the strategy deck? Okay. So we've been hinting about this for a long time, but we have been thinking kind of big picture, like what are we trying to accomplish with Velero? What is our strategy? And so I want to show you what we're thinking and get your feedback on it. We're likely going to head in this direction, but obviously we want to hear what the rest of the community thinks. And I'm calling it the Kubernetes data protection strategy because it actually is a bit larger than Velero, and I think you'll see what I mean by that. So first of all, big picture, what are we trying to achieve? And I'm sorry, the Zoom thing is, there we go. Okay, no, I'm not fiddling with it anymore. So the big picture, what are we trying to achieve? We want data protection to just work in Kubernetes. This is a common thing to say, I know, but right now we feel like data protection is particularly fragmented across different Kubernetes providers and different clouds. And we worry, and frankly, I think we've been seeing it with at least VMware customers, that people are maybe hesitant about really moving workloads to Kubernetes until they're sure they have the data protection that they feel they need. So we really want to unify data protection and make it easy to use. And then we'll see more Kubernetes users, which benefits the whole community. And in terms of what we want to protect right now, as you all know, with Velero, at least, we protect Kubernetes metadata and persistent volumes. And we think we should be looking much, much bigger. We want to protect all apps running in Kubernetes, whether they're whether they're in production environments or in development environments, whether they're kind of made by a specific developer or whether they're a big product. We want everything to be protected in Kubernetes. We want all data stored in Kubernetes to be protected, whether it's in a Cassandra database or Postgres database or what have you. We want all of it to be protected. And we also want all of the Kubernetes infrastructure to be protected so people can bring up their infrastructure, again, configured in the same way if necessary. I'm most familiar with CAPI clusters, but I'm sure there's other examples as well. So our Kubernetes data protection strategy fulfills these needs. The big kind of line items, and I'm going to kind of go through what we think it'll cover, and then we'll get into the details. So one, as I said, we want to cover everything running on Kubernetes and all Kubernetes infrastructure. We think it's really important to have a range of data protection offerings. We love having Velero as this open source option, but we think that for Kubernetes to succeed as a whole, it has to move beyond just folks who want to use open source software and to include we, of course, want to encourage enterprise users to use Kubernetes. So we probably need to make sure that the enterprise data protection vendors can also protect them. So really, we want users to be able to use whichever data protection vendor they want, whether it be Velero or one of the enterprise vendors or somewhere in between. We also want to make it really easy for app developers to define how best to back up their app. As you know, right now, at least with Velero, literally the way we back up apps is snap the PVs and back up the metadata. And that is not necessarily encapsulating the state stored in an app. So we want app developers to be able to tell us how to store or how to back up their app and how to maybe control how their app is quiesced or whatever is needed to take their backup. We also like the idea of as not just production workloads move to Kubernetes, but obviously where development environments will move to Kubernetes. We imagine a world where it'd be really nice for application developers to be able to self-serve, do backup and restore, like, hey, I'm going to try something new, let's do a backup and I can restore my environment if necessary. And also we feel like we're kind of seeing a world where more and more app developers are kind of app operators. And so wouldn't it be nice if when they're deploying a new version of their app, they could quickly roll back and restore a previous version if necessary. So we want this to be self-service without having to open a ticket to a platform team to do that. And lastly, we want to make sure it's easy to migrate data and apps from one cluster to another, even across different clouds and platforms. So this is ambitious, and I want to show you how we're thinking of achieving it using architecture diagrams. So first we'll talk about our current state, and then by showing what we think the future state should be, that will show you visually what we're trying to accomplish. But before I do that, let me pause. I've covered a bunch of stuff. Any questions? Okay. So, and tell me if this is too small. I can, woo, that's not. So tell me if you folks can't see it. So this is how we see the current landscape. Let's start from the bottom. As you know, we back up metadata and volumes. I'm going to focus on volumes because, yeah. I think you all understand here, especially why metadata will kind of shunt to the side for now. So the way we back up volumes currently is, frankly, we tend to use either the Velero volume snapshotters or Restic, and that's what's used to snapshot the raw volumes. And generally what calls that is Velero will call, obviously we'll call this, and or embedded Velero, depending on who we're talking about. So let's work our way up here first. So Tanzu certainly we use Velero to back up Tanzu things, and then we go this path. OpenShift, Rancher, Anthos. I assume those customers of those Kubernetes distributions also do the same. As we know, though, if folks are not using Velero directly, maybe they're using Veritas Net Backup or Dell EMC Power Protect. In that case, both of them use embedded Velero, which then call down. And it's worth noting, of course, there are other ways besides using the Velero infrastructure, like Cast and Beam has their own way of backing up volumes. And lastly, customers can automate by calling directly to Velero, the Velero CLI, or calling to these vendors. And also, these vendors all have specific controls, specific dashboards to control their products. So any questions or comments on this current landscape? This is one way to look at it. I'm sure there's other ways to draw this diagram, but are we aligned on this? Great. So here is what we want to see the future as, what we propose. Let's start at the bottom. Again, We still have volumes, but we have much more now because we want to cover more things. So we want to have databases or data service providers. We want apps that developers have written. And we want to protect infrastructure. I put CAPI, for instance, but also cluster API, but also other Kubernetes clusters. And so our first kind of big proposal then is we want this south-facing Astrolabe API. So the idea is that part of Velero currently, specifically in the Velero plugin for vSphere, there's this Astrolabe infrastructure that takes care of snapshotting and has, I believe, some data mover capacity as well. And so we want to actually decouple that and make this a clear API that is in charge of snapshotting whatever needs to be snapshotted. And this is really powerful for two reasons, this API. One, because then everything here can choose to implement, to customize how they will be snapshotted. They don't have to. The default will be for anything to go snapshot the persistent volumes and copy the metadata as usual. But something like Cassandra can specifically implement this Astrolabe south-facing API and can specify how to be backed up. I just learned today that Cassandra uses something called Medusa to do its backup. And so, for instance, a Cassandra database we think, this is all tentative, but could specify Medusa in their implementation of how they want to be backed up. Ditto with apps, a developer can specify how to back up their app by implementing this API. And you can definitely have complex objects. So for instance, forgive me, I know Tanzu best. So we could have a Tanzu management cluster, a CAPI cluster. Actually, I can do it distribution agnostic. We could have a CAPI management cluster, say, hey, CAPI management cluster, back yourself up. And then its implementation of how to back itself up will be to iterate through its objects, which probably would be its workload clusters and other parts of it. And then each workload cluster will say, hey, how do you back yourself up? And then the workload cluster can iterate through its own objects and say, hey, back up this volume this way, back up this database this way. So this API gives us a common way to have everything defined how to back itself up. Plus, we are really hoping Velero obviously will be calling it because it's just breaking out this Velero infrastructure. We already know Veritas and Dell PowerProtect are using Velero and frankly are using bits of this. We're really hoping, we've heard tentatively good things, that Veritas and PowerProtect will both implement this API and use it. And we're chatting with others, Cass and Veeam and others. We've got no commitments yet, but we're really hoping to encourage other data protection vendors to use this API because then, then they can protect all of these things that implement it. And B, it's kind of great for customers because then depending on if a customer was covered by Dell PowerProtect for other environments, then when they move to Kubernetes, great, they can just use PowerProtect and everything will still be backed up. So let me pause here. Any questions on this Astrolabe south-facing API we're proposing? Oh, and totally open source, to be clear, totally open source, etc. So any questions on this before I move northward?
So I'm not very familiar with the Astrolabe API details. So this tells how to back up, then where, and it will also tell where to back up to. That will also be part of these APIs.
It'll definitely say the how. For the where question, I'm going to defer to Dave to answer that.
It's very similar to what we're currently doing inside the plugin. So, for example, our current path has the snapshot, on vSphere, our snapshot path for PowerProtect and Velero goes down through the plugin. We take a snapshot and then we give that back, and then PowerProtect figures out how to move things. And so we're going to keep this ability to separate data movement from snapshotting where it's appropriate. But rather than, for example, having to trigger a Velero backup, so the Kate's cluster box, that's actually that piece of Velero that currently serializes a Kubernetes cluster, the item backupper, essentially. And so that moves to being an open API where you don't have to do a Velero backup in order to trigger the serializer, and Velero continues to have its plugins inside, but then is able to call out to additional Astrolabe things. So that's the kind of the goal here, is to get it so that you don't have to embed all of Velero to get the pieces that you want to work with, and that we can also provide additional pieces under this Astrolabe API that plug in to all of our data protection partners and everybody who wants to on Kubernetes, so that, for example, like we have TDS databases where we're providing Postgres, and snapping the volumes may not be the best way to do that. So we're looking at how do we, for example, have the operator provide a backup and restore capability with a common API that we can then trigger from like the Velero, from the Kubernetes serializer through the Astrolabe APIs. So that's kind of the goal here.
Yeah, I was gonna say, did that answer your question?
Yeah. So it looks like there will be hooks, right, on how we move the data once it's snapshotted. Yeah,
and there's things built into the APIs that have, there's like multiple transports that could be provided. So you can provide different transports, like on vSphere, we might return a VADP transport, and eventually we'd like to return, say, an S3 transport, but you can pick which one you want to use, because they're really just, how do I get to the snapshot? On EBS, we may return like EBS direct is available, and we also have a way to get to it through, like a S3 style API.
I have a question, because if you look at the previous chart, the volume is a resource in Kubernetes, but there is no a resource in Kubernetes that has a one-one mapping to a developer app, right? So that means, yeah.
Well, that's something that we can define. So there's various ways to do this, right? So there's the Kubernetes app thing that's going on. Operators can define, resources that represent instances of apps. And we're also Kasten has the canister technology that lets them define a thing to be backed up. And we can even do it from Velero, where we say, hey, include namespace X. So these are all different ways that we could specify an application.
But that means the developer app will be architected in a certain way so that it can work with Astrolabe API.
It can continue to do exactly what it's doing right now. So we can continue to just back up plain old Kubernetes resources and volumes. If that works for the application, not a problem. But if we have a more sophisticated application that has sequencing needs and stuff, it's like Harbor, right? We're looking at backup Harbor. We need to snap the Postgres database. We need to snap Redis. So how do we do that? And how do we make that available to something like Velero or any of our other partners? Because what we'd like to do is we figure out one way to back up Harbor, and we don't have to re-implement that. We don't have, Power Protect doesn't have to re-implement that. So that's the goal there. And so, yeah, you can have things that are just a bunch of Kubernetes resources and a bunch of PVs, and we'll continue to back them up the way we're currently doing them.
Okay.
Any other questions before we move? Oh yeah, keep going, please. This discussion.
So that CBT discussion we are having in the working group, right? Would that fall somewhere here when in this kind of arc?
So as an interim thing, the Astrolabe APIs, right? So right now what we're missing in CSI is just take volumes and nothing else, right? So on CSI, we can get a snapshot. We can clone the snapshot to a volume, and we can delete the snapshot. But we don't have, for example, like a standard way to get access to the data. And we don't have kind of standard ways to get the change block tracking between snapshots. So I would say that we get this change block tracking stuff into Astrolabe first. And then after we've proven it out a bit, we push it down towards CSI. And also we have to deal with our legacy stuff that's not using CSI snapshotting. And that's going to continue on for a while until everybody gets off of the older Kubernetes.
Other comments, questions before I move on to this move northward? Excellent. Thank you for the discussion. So we've talked a bit about this API that really helps us snapshot things that need to be snapshotted. But there's another part of data protection, which is how do you control the data protection provider? And so right here, we've got different data protection providers, as we've talked about. And so we, obviously this was driven by Tanzu's needs a bit, but we like this idea of driving it to be an open source API to benefit the community at large. Basically, we've got these Kubernetes distributions, Tanzu, OpenShift, Rancher, Anthos, et cetera. And we all have the same needs for data protection. And so we're imagining a not huge, a limited API thing, but things that might do a backup cluster, restore cluster, backup namespace, restore namespace. With the idea then that ideally these data protection providers would implement these simpler API commands for data protection. And of course, yeah. And so that way then, as a standard across Kubernetes, if we can manage this, this way we, again, customers, Kubernetes users have this freedom then when they choose a Kubernetes distribution, they're not limited to one provider or another, or they get a very nice integration without as much effort by the providers, by the distributions, et cetera, so that we get this nice, clean way to swap out a provider and put in the provider of choice for a particular customer. And I will note, of course, that this API, customer automations can still call it. And for more complicated measures, maybe storage tiering or rather, I think Dave has given me examples like calling to tape or doing specific things. I'll let, maybe Dave has an example. I realized I was not prepared. Okay, is what I said okay? Okay,
sure.
great.
I mean, there's all kind. I mean, there's a million things you can do. Each vendor has different, schedulers or constraints or things, right? Or being able to check the compliance of every backup, right? All these are things that should be, these are areas where the products are different, and
Right.
we want them to remain different.
Exactly. And so for these more complicated calls, vendor-specific controls like the Dell Power Protect dashboard will still be the thing that's used by maybe a backup admin. But for simpler data protection calls, it would go through this API. Now, before we talk about this, open up to questions. So first of all, it'd be open source is what we're proposing. I want to talk quickly, maybe address the elephant in the room about why everyone would want it. So I think it's very clear why Kubernetes users would benefit, because they suddenly get standardization for data protection over 2 APIs across the community. So more options, more standardization, I think generally very much benefits the Kubernetes user. And then therefore they can choose who they like, who they want to use. Sorry about that. The distributions benefit because suddenly now, instead of having to work hard to integrate first Veritas and then Velero and Dell Power Protect, all the distributions suddenly have integrated all the data protection providers who implement this north-facing API. So yay for them. And if anyone who uses this Astrolabe API, if we can get this going as a standard, then all these things that were formerly not back upable in a good way are now easy to snapshot. The thing I want to call out is certainly I can imagine from a data protection provider point of view, this may seem like a more dangerous deal because they're being constrained by 2 APIs and being made very swappable. And I merely, to start the conversation, I would push back on that and point out that I think that there's a lot that these data protection providers can, a place where they can differentiate themselves in terms of their storage tiering. There's a number of things that are independent of how they interact with the distributions and how they snapshot bits, where they can still differentiate themselves. So just wanted to call that out. We will see in practice whether data protection providers are willing to implement these 2 APIs. I think that this one will be the easier sell because it's already being used by a number of providers, and it allows access to Kubernetes infrastructure that I think Velero has had a head start on. We're less sure about this, but we are. So it's a place, it's something we want to explore further. So before I get into a few more slides, let me ask, are there questions, especially technical questions around this API or the whole proposal?
So for any Kubernetes distributions, to accomplish the real world backup and restore work, it seems that they still need to deal with the vendor specific controls, right? So now they need to call the north-facing OSS API, but at the same time, they still need to deal with the vendor specific controls.
Well, they don't have to call the vendors. They don't have to call either one. So they can use everything through the vendor specific controls if they want to, because all of these things already provide ways to say back up a cluster. They can also, if their needs are simple, right? So like a lot of people, like for example, like Velero will mostly run through this north-facing API. There's not going to be a lot of extras for Velero. But what we see in a lot of larger environments is there's already a data protection system in place, especially in on-prem environments. We've got Power Protect installed. We've got Net Backup installed. There's a team that takes care of that, that manages, the tape tiering and all that stuff. But from the Kubernetes point of view, hey, do you want to learn about Net Backup? Do you want to learn about Veritas? Power Protect, or would we rather, have a simplified API that we can use? And, selfishly from inside of Tanzu, we want to provide like a unified experience where we can swap out providers, or we give people Velero initially, because that's what comes in the box. But Velero is intentionally not going to go head to head with Veritas or Power Protect, because there's just a whole bunch of stuff there that we can't do. But we do want to have this experience where if a user says, yes, I've installed Tanzu and I've installed Velero and this is good, but suddenly I need a much bigger system to handle this, that there's a nice upgrade path for them where it's not suddenly like, oh my, because you switched to Power Protect, this and this don't work, or whatever, right? So that's what we don't want to. That's selfishly, that's our our goal.
Yeah, I understand, but if you think into the details, the reason user want a net backups, for example, instead of Velero, because they want net backup specific things. So how I'm just a little curious how this north-facing API can cover all these vendor specific things.
Well,
I mean, a
wouldn't
lot
an
of the-
example? Oh, just a quick question, Dave. Wouldn't an example be like you said you could throttle backup network? So maybe you set up certain settings for throttling the backup network, but then each time you actually want to do a backup, you're still just saying backup cluster.
Exactly.
Would that be an
So yeah, that's an example. Or for example, you've installed a tape system. Velero doesn't do anything with tape. But that's all stuff that you're going to control through the existing vendor APIs. Or when do I tier things off? Like we have some on-prem storage and it tiers it off to an object store at Amazon. Those are all vendor specific controls. When is this happening? How is this going to happen?
Remember to, just a quick note, just that also we're seeing more of a movement towards developers having more autonomy as they do their development. And so we're seeing a lot of these simpler API commands like backup cluster, restore cluster to maybe be used by developers as they do development environments. Whereas the hardcore backup would still be owned by the backup vendor, maybe using the vendor specific controls.
Yeah, that was my question. So we are envisioning like this API more for self-service use cases where the DevOps folks want to trigger the backup and restores.
This is what we're imagining. It hasn't been totally validated, but exactly, that is certainly a use case we're imagining.
And we've discussed, TMC. TMC right now, the only plugin for it for data protection is Velero. And so this API actually came out of how do we get other data protection vendors plugged into Tanzu Mission Control.
One thing that's common for our Tanzu customers is we're oftentimes talking to an enterprise customer and they want to continue using the data protection vendor that they're already using for other environments. And so this is where I think it really benefits everyone. It benefits the Kubernetes distributions because we get someone to move to Kubernetes who is maybe resistant. The data protection provider gets to keep their customer, but cover a new area. And so because it's all swappable, we've got all these integrations already in place, or because everyone's using an API, we've got these integrations easily in place as opposed to having to laboriously build out each one.
And the API is, and the endpoint for this API is in the cluster, or?
Well, this is complicated, Dave. I don't know if you want to talk about. We've been
at this point, it's probably going to be it's going to be run through some kind of a Kubernetes resource type thing. And the real question on our in front of us right now is whether we go down basically like Velero, where we can write things like backup or restore resources, or if we move towards something that's more policy based, where you can set things like policies on the cluster that say back me up every day using this backup policy. So those are things we are going to have to figure out. And I think that's something where we'll talk with all of the potential implementers of this, including you, right? Because a big part of this is originally this was just going to be for Tanzu usage and be available for TMC plus Tanzu customers. And as we're having this discussion internally, it was like, well, why don't we just open source this and make sure this is available everywhere, and let everybody else, not just the data protection vendors, but also the other distributions in the community have a say in what this needs to do. So that's why we're going down this path. But it's not very well set in stone, other than it should be run through Kubernetes, I think, the same way most other things are right now.
Yeah, but just to emphasize what Dave said, the south-facing Astrolabe API has been, I think, percolating in Dave's brain for years now. So we've got a better sense of that. This north-facing API is much fresher. And in both cases, we want input, but especially the north-facing is very amorphous right now.
And we haven't gotten to the naming committee yet, so we don't have like an official name for it.
Right, north-facing is not the prettiest name ever. Clearly, that will not continue. So other architecture questions before I get through the last few slides? Or actually, rather, unless there's urgent questions, I'd love to get through because we have 7 minutes left. So just to call out, this is a list. This is the list I showed up here, the things we want to cover with our strategy. Just want to point out, to cover everything running on Kubernetes and all Kubernetes infrastructure, that south-facing API lets us do that. To work with it, whichever data protection vendor a user wants, the 2 APIs together really let the user choose whichever vendor they want, and ideally they fit in to the whole architecture. Allowing app developers to easily define how best to back up their apps. That Astrolabe API, that south-facing one, lets you define. The self-service backup is, as we talked about, really the north-facing API allows that. And that easy migration is especially that south-facing API. We'll get that, we won't go into those details, but feel free to ask another time. Now, to best fulfill this Kubernetes data protection strategy, both these APIs ideally need to be widely adopted, perhaps even becoming Kubernetes community standards like CSI, CNI. Very ambitious goals. So we'll see if we manage that. Some next steps. Now, actually, I should have put this here. For sure, we need to start bringing this to the data protection working group. So maybe I'll even just call that out here. Go to DP working group. So that is definitely on our agenda. Specifically for that south-facing API, we'll talk about this more hopefully next week, but we have a data mover work coming in 1.8. Bridget's going to be working on that especially. We definitely do want to do this Astrolabe decoupling. We've been calling that, thinking that that will be Velero 2.0. Sometime next year, I assume that that'll be out, but no commitments yet. Oh, and we want to work with data protection vendors to understand what may be needed with the API to perhaps get them to adopt it, to encourage adoption. Oh, and I put it here. Okay, so I didn't forget. Sorry, it's late at night for me. It's 9 p.m. And of course, we want to work with the data protection working group. North-facing API. So it's, well, yeah, okay. So it's already an approved Tanzu strategy, so we know we're going to do this. So really our next steps are we want to talk with the OpenShift folk and Rancher and Anthos to see if other Kubernetes distributions want to do this. Obviously, if this is like hearing like a yes, then we would go and work with data protection vendors to see how open they are. And of course, the working group again. So that's that for next steps. I apologize. This is the first time I'm giving this presentation, so I clearly did not think as well through the slides as I should have. And I just want to call out, we are not going to abandon Velero by any means. Even though we are taking the infrastructure bit, we still have some big features on the long-term roadmap. Things like we want to replace Rustic with Copia to eliminate a dependency on kind of a less stable backup path and to get incremental backup and CBT. This does not mean if you're using Rustic, suddenly everything's going to fall apart. We're just going to replace for an end user experience, which should look like a similar experience from what I understand. But just FYI, we're thinking of something like Copia. Just to call out that keeping up with core Kubernetes changes is big work. 122 was a lot of work. And of course, we will continue to keep Velero up to date. We constantly hear about multi-cluster support. Tentatively right now, we're thinking scope to a single CAPI management cluster and its associated workload clusters, but that's very much not defined yet. We oftentimes hear about encryption at rest. It's pretty important to a lot of users. We're considering increasing performance through parallelization, both parallelizing within a single backup, parallelizing the resources that are being backed up, and then having parallelizing multiple backups running at the same time. We've got a pretty big bug backlog right now. We're not loving that, so we'd really love to work that down in the GitHub repo. We'd love to improve our documentation and more things. So none of these things, we'll talk about 1.8 next meeting. None of these things are scheduled yet, to be very clear, but they are absolutely on our minds. We are not going to suddenly stop working on Velero. So we only have 3 minutes today, but certainly this is an open plea. Please, please, please give us feedback. We really want to hear what you think. We hope that this will be a conversation of future community meetings as we work through these ideas. So any questions in the last few minutes? Okay, well, let me just say, is there anyone else? We do have 3 minutes left. Are there other issues that are non-strategy related that people would like to discuss?
Not strategy, but so we are seeing a lot of, I guess, from customers, right? What vulnerabilities, I guess, security being in focus. So I guess one of the questions that's being asked is, like, is there any like a support statement in the sense, I know it's open source community, what is the timelines that vulnerabilities will be addressed in, and questions like those?
I'll try to answer that question one moment, but just so I actually don't know which company are you from, or do you mind saying, or would you prefer
This
not?
Sukana, I don't know, this is from Dell Protect.
Oh, you're also from Dell. Cool.
Yeah.
I think the short answer is we don't have any published timelines for addressing security vulnerabilities. I don't have a good answer. Great question. Does anyone else on the call have a better answer?
Well, I would say that at this point, we've seen very few actual vulnerabilities in Velero. That doesn't mean they aren't there, but those aren't what's being reported. What people do is they'll do a scan, they scan the container, they say, oh, this library, has a bug in it. And it's like, yes, it does, except we don't use that library. So I think Distroless will cut down on that a lot. And then it's mainly a matter of that now it's going to be like upgrading to the latest Go, because that's going to be the thing that mainly bites us in like glibc in the Distroless containers. So that's going to cut down on the number of these reports. And then we're going to have to, if there's actually a Velero vulnerability where it's like, hey, if I write this resource, I get to, I don't know, erase every disk in the system. I think we would respond to that very rapidly. That would be our goal. But most of these things right now are not actually bugs, and they're are not actually vulnerabilities in Velero itself, and they're typically not even, going to be triggered by Velero. It's not something you could exploit in Velero. That's my thinking.
Yeah,
And
but in that case, like, should we respond saying it's a false positive kind of thing? It won't affect, even though it's there in the image, this library, it is not used.
That's a perfectly reasonable way to respond. The other thing is to ask them to, with the Distroless move, as soon as you're ready with the plugin to work in the Distroless environment, you can say, hey, we fixed a bunch, we cleaned up a bunch of these things. You can look at any of these CVs. So all these things that are being reported against packages in the container are fixed in 1.7 by going to Distroless, or almost all of them. And we've also upgraded from like Go 1.14, 1.13 to Go 1.16. So a bunch of the Go, what's reported as Go vulnerabilities should be going away.
Right. Yeah. So so in Dell, we are using Twistlock. So I guess that's the plan. We will scan 1.7 with Twistlock, and then I guess maybe next meeting we can discuss what we see.
Yeah, definitely. And we just have to see how we move forward. I don't know. I think we tried to use the very latest Distroless image, and that's pretty much coming out of Google. So hopefully they're moving pretty quickly on fixing those things.
Okay, thanks.
And as a last security note, I will mention that internally, VMware is doing a threat analysis of Velero with Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. Nothing has been turned up so far. Certainly, if there is, I'm sure we'll address it. But tentatively, we are having some additional security experts looking at Velero in the context of other VMware things. So that should give a little bit of additional comfort from a security point of view. So without further ado, I see we're a minute over. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful night or morning, depending on your time zone. And we'll see you all, I believe, next week. Or some of you will see next week. Some of you will be sleeping. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.